Hey everyone, this is Nitro. So I recently realized that there's actually a lot of confusion over how damage reduction and damage increase effects work, so I thought I would do a thorough breakdown of this mechanic. In truth, damage reduction can really be broken down into several simple rules. Rule number 1. Damage reduction and addition effects are additive. In simple words, if you manage to stack 100% damage reduction on your characters, it's going to take 1 damage per strike from the enemy. And since enemies do a total of 40 strike, you just take 40 damage. Okay. It can also be a mix of damage received effects on your hero and also reduced damage dealt effects on the enemy characters. So for example, Jormungandr's Eye can apply a damage reduction effect of 15% damage reduction on the enemy, right? So if we click on it, right, decrease damage dealt by 15% for 1 enemy within 2 blocks. And then similarly, Olivier's Roaring Bomb skill will apply a 20% damage dealt reduction effect on the enemy. Now, keep in mind that enemies can only have 1 damage dealt reduction effect on them. So you can't stack, let's say, Olivier's Roaring Bomb for 20% with Jormungandr's Eye for another 15%. It doesn't work. What will end up happening is there is only Olivier's damage dealt minus 20% effect on the enemy. So, continuing on. Other than that, countering these kind of damage reduction effects is damage increasing effects. So the most common example that we've seen is Charon, right? All damage received is increased by 15% for 1 enemy within 3 blocks. Now, overall though, the most commonly seen example of 100% damage reduction effect has been Emmerich. Because Emmerich, with some luck on his soldiers, can reduce melee physical damage by 100%, which means Emmerich's Royal Cavalry will take any physical strike and take like 40 damage. So as we saw in that clip, Emmerich tanked a hit from Vargas using Power Stab, and the Royal Cavalry took 40 damage. And then Emmerich tanked another hit, this time from Juggler with Beast Shock, and took 40 damage again. So, this leads to actually rule number 2, which is that soldiers and heroes have separate damage reductions. In truth, it is this rule where most of the confusion occurs. Soldiers like, for example, Royal Cavalry, Angels, and Phalanx soldiers all have their own personal damage reduction effect, right? Royal Cavalry reduce physical damage by 45%, Angels reduce magic damage taken by 45%, and Phalanx soldiers reduce physical damage taken by 30%. However, this damage reduction does not apply to the hero himself. The easiest way to see an example of this is if you take an AoE attack in PvP or whatever. Okay. When you tank that AoE attack, you will see that the soldiers will take a lot less damage than the hero does. So, the question then is, what damage reduction affects only the hero, which damage reduction effects only apply to the soldier, and then which damage reduction effects applies to both. Rule number 3. Hero talents, luck-based triggers, and buffs affect both soldiers and heroes. Emmerich's talent, where when attacked, damage taken is decreased by 20%, will also affect his soldiers. That is why Emmerich's Royal Cavalry, when they're used, have a base 65% damage reduction against physical attacks. When you combo this 65% with Heavy Shield, which reduces damage by another 50%, you're looking at 115% damage reduction. Second, luck triggers refers to equipment that have a chance of activating. The perfect example would be Bloodline Magic Armor. Here, Emmerich, who is above 80% hit points on his Royal Cavalry, will take a Beast Shock hit, and only Bloodline Magic Armor will trigger, so Heavy Shield does not. This, in total, gives Emmerich 95% damage reduction. So, what happens then is Beast Shock ends up doing a measly 460 damage with a crit hit. So, as we just saw, Bloodline Magic Armor activating to provide another 30% damage reduction gave Emmerich's soldiers a 95% damage reduction. So 95% was not quite enough to reduce the damage taken to 40, but it was still, 485 damage taken by the Royal Cavalry, which is still next to nothing. Other things that are luck triggers include, for example, the Aeolus Battle Armor, which triggers against ranged attacks rather than melee attacks, and they also include some soldier effects. In particular, soldier effects include Bolt Rangers. Even though Bolt Rangers at level 10 have a 100% chance to decrease damage taken by 50% before entering battle, this is still a luck trigger. And similarly, another luck trigger would be Holy Pegasus, because it triggers before attacking with a 100% chance to decrease damage taken by 50%. As for buffs that apply damage reduction effects, it's quite straightforward. For example, Tiaris' Miracle is a buff that applies 15% damage reduction. Iris, with her Le Jardin Iris, applies a 20% damage reduction effect. And finally, Olivier's Talent, because it applies a buff effect on your characters, and the buff effect is that the character gets 10% damage reduction for 2 turns, is another example of a buff. So, with all these examples of effects that affect both soldiers and heroes, let's move on to rule number 4. Equipment and equipment enchants only affect the hero. What this means is, in particular, Last Rites, where when hit points of this unit is 100%, lowers all damage taken by 40%. This is an effect that only affects the hero. It does not affect soldiers. If it did, it would be ridiculously overpowered in truth, because it would mean that, for example, Juggler, if he equipped Last Rites, would end up with soldiers that take 10% damage, right? Lobster Behemoths have a 50% damage reduction. If Last Rites affected the soldiers as well, they would take 10% damage from everything, as long as Triton was active. And that is not the case. So, other than Last Rites, which is not a luck trigger, the enchant Steel, which decreases damage taken by 10%, only affects the hero once again. Enchants have always only applied to the hero, in truth, right? Whether it's the enchant values increase or the enchant impact. So, other than the enchant, other gear, like the SR Amulet and the SR Scryer, also only affect the hero. So there is actually a reason to use SR gear now, because other than those two SRs, there is currently no other SR gear that provides damage reduction, whether it's SR or SSR, right? Scryer at level 50 will decrease range damage taken by 10%, and the Amulet decreases melee damage taken by 10%. So it makes keeping one copy of each and building it to level 50 worth considering. So, with all this, there is actually only one hero in the game who can reach 100% damage reduction. And that is a flyer, Ultimuller, who is at least at 5 stars. The reason Ultimuller can actually hit 100% damage reduction is actually quite simple. First, he can equip Last Rites, and Last Rites will provide 40% damage reduction. Second, with his exclusive Regular Crown, increasing the buffs that you cast on yourself to last for 1 extra turn, Ultimuller can permanently maintain Raging Thunder, the Wind Ride effect from Raging Thunder specifically. And Wind Ride will provide a 15% melee damage decrease as long as hit points is above 50%. Third, at 5 stars, Ultimuller's talent, Supreme Overlord, each stack of the Supreme Overlord buff will decrease damage taken by 4%. Mine is currently 3% because he's only 4 stars. But at 4% with 4 stacks, you're looking at a 16% damage reduction from this. So far, he will have 40% from Last Rites, up to 55% from Raging Thunder, up to 71% from 4 stacks of Supreme Overlord, and then in addition to this, if you throw in Olivier 10%, that will be 81%. You throw in the SR Amulet for 10% melee damage reduction, that will be 91%. And then if you do choose to give Ultimuller the Steel enchant, he will hit 101% damage reduction, just like that. Now, with that said, I don't think you actually need to hit the full 100% damage reduction. Specifically, if you have, let's say, Olivier tossing out Roaring Bomb on the critical turns to do a 20% damage reduction effect on the enemy, you can definitely work with, let's say, 81% damage reduction or so. 80% damage reduction and you'll be fine. So maybe you don't need the Steel enchant, and maybe you don't need the Amulet on Ultimuller, so that he can carry, let's say, an Overlord's badge or Slayer's emblem or something similar, so that he can do more damage. But it is interesting to note that Ultimuller is the only character who can hit 100% damage reduction, guaranteed, and it will be 100% for every single turn, because it doesn't require anything like, you know, let's say Tiaris' Miracle Effect, which gives 5% more damage reduction, but it only lasts 2 turns and has a cooldown of 4 turns, so it can't be permanently maintained. Alright, so with all that mentioned, let's move on to the 5th rule. And the 5th rule is about the effects that only apply to soldiers. So, the only damage reduction effects that apply to soldiers exclusively are very straightforward. It's the training ground text as well as the soldier skills. So, let me actually repeat that one more time though. Training ground texts only apply to soldiers. They do not affect heroes. So for example, Holy Light Protection, that gives Holy and Mage, when Holy and Mage hit points is at 100%, damage taken is decreased by a certain percentage. This does not apply to your hero. So you can't research this to level 10, let's say, and get a 30% damage reduction effect on all your healers and mages. Alright. And as for soldier skills, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Soldier skills only apply to themselves. So Lancers, with their 30% physical damage reduction, only affects themselves. This 30% damage reduction does not apply to the hero, right? Similarly, you know, it can be most clearly seen by, let's say, sorceresses, right? Because when sorcerer's hit points is at 100%, attack and magic defense is increased by 45%. This effect certainly doesn't affect your general or hero. It only affects the sorceresses themselves. The one exception to this is Shrine Maidens. But that's because the Shrine Maiden's skill description specifically says when soldier hit points are at 100%, physical damage taken by the hero is reduced by 70%. So this effect doesn't affect the Shrine Maidens themselves. Instead, it only affects the hero. So, in conclusion, other than Ulte Muller, who can guaranteed permanently hit 100% damage reduction, there's several other heroes who can potentially hit 100% damage reduction, but it generally relies on luck or applying debuffs onto the enemy, right? For example, Emmerich can hit 100% damage reduction on his soldiers with some luck triggers, but overall, they are capped out at a 75% damage reduction consistent rate, right? That remaining 25% has to come from either somehow managing to debuff the enemy by 25% or from Emmerich getting luck and activating luck triggers. Other than Emmerich, the other characters who can hit 100% damage reduction would be anyone who can equip Shrine Maidens. Shrine Maidens provide a 75% damage reduction effect on the hero. Olivier provides another 10% for 85% damage reduction effect. So you just need 15% more. And that 15% more can come from, let's say, Olivier's Roaring Bomb, applying that 20% damage reduction. It can come from equipping any character with an Alchemist robe. Because, once again, we're going to SRs, but the Alchemy robe has a 50% chance to reduce enemies' damage dealt by 20%, and it lasts 2 turns. So with a level 51, you have a 50% chance, and that can be the luck trigger you need to get your damage reduction over the 100% mark. It's because of this that you can see clips of Hein tanking an attack from Sleipnir, such as this clip of Hein taking a 5009 attack Sleipnir strike. And there we go. That's just about everything I wanted to say about damage reduction effects. I'm just going to make one final point though, which isn't really a rule, and that's skills do not have any impact towards the damage reduction effects. For example, we saw in the first clip I showed where Juggler used Beast Shock against Emmerich, and Vargas also used Power Stab against Emmerich. Both of those attacks, which are supposed to do additional damage to the enemies, end up just doing 40 damage. So clearly, skills do not affect damage reduction. Once you have 100% damage reduction, even if the enemy tosses a skill at you, they'll still do minimal damage anyways. So on that final point, I hope you all found this video useful. And on that note, Nitro out.